Before we delve a little deeper into Lamarck and Darwin, we'll just go through this list and make sure everybody has the right idea. For the Greeks, like Aristotle and Plato, it says in your textbook, they believed that all life existed in a perfected and unchanging form. In other words, they believed that species did not change. So things were not evolving, things were staying the way they were. It says a little bit later that they said that species had all been created independently of one another. In other words, one species didn't create another one. Okay, so that is their big idea. The next person on the list, so Georges Louis Leclerc, the Comte de Buffon, that's his title, it says he was one of the first people to challenge this idea publicly. So his big contribution is that he is challenging the idea of organisms changing or not changing. He further proposed, if you read a little bit later, that humans and apes might have a common ancestor. Oh, you can bet that idea was popular at the time. Super popular. Hey, people who think that they're perfect. I think that you and apes have a common ancestor. I don't think it was a super popular idea the first time he pronounced it. He also suggested that the Earth was way older than we thought it was, and so did someone else a bit later on, but that was important too. If we're talking about Cuvier, Cuvier studied fossils. So some of his ideas were that, for example, a species could go extinct. How did he prove that? Well, he found fossils in layers of rocks of organisms that didn't exist right now. They must have existed, they left a fossil, but they don't exist now. Another way that Cuvier contributed was that he noticed that the deeper he went in the rock, the more different the fossils got. So that implied that things were changing, that something was happening as time passed and things were changing. If we move on to Lyell, it says that, because he was talking about geological processes. And he reasoned that the Earth is probably way older than 6,000 years, so something similar to what Georges Louis Leclerc said. And so he said, based on this Earth geology evidence that processes are slow, then if that's the way it happened with organisms, well, then organisms might have changed as slowly over time as the Earth did. So his evidence was geology, and his idea was that slow, subtle processes could happen over a long period of time. That's what it said. Now, if we consider Lamarck, Lamarck's big thing was that he thought that species got more and more complex over time. So they just continually got better and better and better and better and better. He also thought that organisms could develop a characteristic and pass it on. The textbook has inheritance of acquired characteristics in bold. That's kind of like the name of his theory, inheritance of acquired characteristics. What's his proof? He used fossils. He looked at fossils and saw, hey, fossils changed over time, so that's my proof that this is happening. Now, if we consider Darwin, he's got a lot of stuff to say, but his basic idea about evolution is natural selection. He thinks that organisms who were well adapted survived and passed their traits on. Some of his proof that would support natural selection, and you don't have to have all of these, would be, hey, organisms in one area of the world were not the same as organisms in another area. He found fossils, like other people, that looked similar to but not the same as current organisms. He went to the Galapagos Islands and he noticed lots of things. First, he noticed that the Galapagos Islands had similar but not identical animals to South America, which is what they're close to. But then on each individual island, he found different kinds of finches. This is probably his most famous thing, the finches and their beaks. So that supported his idea of organisms being adapted to their environment. He also noticed that sexual reproduction leads to variation, so that might explain how or why organisms change. Now, does anyone want to ask anything about basically what each person said? I wouldn't ask you to memorize like word for word what someone's theory was. If you could give me the basic gist of their idea, that would be enough. Now, we need to talk a little bit more specifically about Lamarck because his idea had a lot of merit on the surface. Do you have a question? Okay. Now, there are a couple of pictures, and I want to explain to you why you have them. The first picture illustrates what Jean Lamarck said was happening as organisms changed over time. So remember, he had fossil evidence of change. And so, for example, there is fossil evidence that a giraffe ancestor actually had a shorter neck, and that our current giraffe looks more like this one. So he's got some fossil evidence that shows this progression. Now here's what Lamarck said. Lamarck said that organisms changed because they needed to. They wanted to. They decided to. Okay? So, ancestor giraffe said to himself, "Oh, I wish I could reach those leaves at the top of the tree. I'm so hungry. I will just stretch my neck so that it gets longer so that I can reach the leaves at the top." According to him, that ancestor would stretch its neck and be able to pass this crazy stretchy neck gene on to his offspring. Okay? I can see some of you kind of smiling like, that sounds silly, that's not how things work. But you got to remember at this point in time, we didn't have as much knowledge about how genetics work as we do today. So this seemed reasonable. It made total sense that organisms' environments were having some sort of impact on evolution. So he thought that the environment played a role. Now, out of those three things that I just said about Jean Lamarck's theory, two of them I think people would still accept as true. First, yep, there is fossil evidence that I can see, I can look at it, I can touch it, I can see that there were different organisms that used to exist because I can look at their fossil. It's this middle point, this one that causes a bit of problem. Let's say that you decided that you wanted to have blue eyes. And so you just, I don't know, cried a lot, and then hopefully that turned your eyes blue. I'm trying to think of something silly sounding because it's the same principle. I can just decide that I would like a trait and do something to make it happen. So he focused a lot on use or disuse. If I use some part of my body, it should develop and get better, like this giraffe's neck, develop and get longer and stretch out over time. So with his logic, here's what should happen. In the second picture, there's a man and a lady. They both like to ride their bicycles a lot. Maybe they've been in the Tour de France and they have massive leg muscles. Their baby should have massive leg muscles. Should, yep. According to this theory, they acquired that trait by using their leg muscles and they pass it on to their offspring. So their baby should come out with ripped quads. Like, the baby should just be ripped. Maybe not his other muscles, but those leg muscles, man, they should be huge. So here's the problem. The environment doesn't cause directional genetic mutations. And inherited or inheritable traits are generally not acquired. So if I could address that first point, Yes, the environment can absolutely cause mutations to your genetic material. Think nuclear explosion. Of course, the environment can cause mutations, but being outside on a warm day isn't going to purposefully cause your DNA to mutate so that now you can resist heat. That's what I mean by directional. Yes, mutations can happen, but mutations don't happen in response to the environment. They happen, and then if they help you in the environment, you survive. The other point is this, that says inheritable traits are generally not acquired ones. If you acquire a trait, that's not typically something that you can pass on. Now, there is quite a large debate that still reigns over where particular traits come from. Are they heritable or not? Things especially like behavioral traits, which is why I'm using words like generally and probably, because quite frankly, like I said before, there's a lot of stuff that we don't know for sure. Now, does anyone have questions that they want to ask about Lamarck?